The chill of the abandoned mine clings to her skin, a promise of a slow, cold death, until a flicker of lantern light cuts through the darkness, bringing not just a stranger, but a sliver of hope. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe survival can lead to love, hit like and subscribe for more. He sees a mute woman, broken and chained. He doesn't know she carries a secret that could ignite a war with a powerful railroad baron, or that her silence is her shield. Her story, and his, began in the shadowed earth. The air in the Serpent's Tooth mine lay heavy and dead, thick with the scent of damp stone and despair. Dr. Alastair Finch moved cautiously, his lantern casting dancing shadows that writhed like troubled spirits on the jagged walls. A grizzled prospector, half-mad with solitude and cheap whiskey, had mumbled something about a she-whale in the old diggings, a sound that wasn't animal nor wind. Alastair, accustomed to the grim realities of the frontier, had learned to investigate even the unlikeliest of tales. Lives sometimes hung on such whispers. He found her in the deepest chamber, where the ore had long since been plundered. A heavy chain, cruelly bolted to the rock face, held her by one slender ankle. She was a sculpture of misery, dirt-caked and still, her dress torn, the skin of her wrists and the tethered ankle rubbed raw and bloody. When the lantern light fell upon her face, her eyes flew open, wide and dark in the grime, reflecting a terror so profound it stole Alastair's breath. They were the eyes of a hunted animal, expecting a final blow, not rescue. She made no sound, no plea, only stared. Alastair, a man whose hands were as skilled with a miner's pick as a surgeon's scalpel when need arose, knelt. He kept his voice low, a soothing rumble that he hoped wouldn't spook her further. "I'm here to help." He didn't expect an answer and received none. With meticulous care, he examined the bolt and chain. It was crudely effective. He set down the lantern and retrieved a small pry bar and hammer from his worn leather satchel. The metallic clang of his tools against the rock was brutally loud in the suffocating silence, punctuated only by her shallow, hitched breaths. Each strike sent tremors through the stone, and he saw her flinch, bracing for pain. He worked with a focused attachment, a habit honed by years of treating suffering in places forgotten by God and man. When the bolt finally gave, the chain clattered to the ground. She remained motionless, her eyes still fixed on him, wary and unblinking. Gently, Alastair reached for her, but she recoiled, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He paused, then slowly, carefully, gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a child, fragile as dried autumn leaves. As he carried her from the oppressive darkness of the mine, the sudden, harsh glare of the afternoon sun made her gasp, burying her face against his rough-spun shirt. His cabin was a small, sturdy structure nestled in a sparse aspen grove, miles from the nearest flyspeck settlement. It was his refuge, his clinic, his solitary world. He laid her on his own narrow cot, the only soft furnishing in the Spartan room. Her trauma was a palpable thing, a miasma clinging to her like the mine's dust. He cleaned her wounds with practiced hands, applied salve, and wrapped them in clean linen. Throughout it all, she remained silent, her gaze following his every move, a deep, unreadable suspicion in their depths. He wondered what horrors had brought her to this state, what had driven someone to such barbarity. He understood her silence. Sometimes, the world offered nothing worth saying. He himself had come to this wild, unforgiving land seeking an escape from a past laden with its own unspoken griefs, the clamor of a city practice traded for the quiet agony and occasional stark beauty of the frontier. Days bled into a routine of quiet care. Alastair tended to her injuries, coaxed broth and weak tea past her lips. He spoke little, sensing words were a currency she didn't wish to trade. He'd leave fresh water and a piece of bread by the cot when he went out to check his snares or gather herbs, and upon his return, they would be gone. Slowly, the raw terror in her eyes began to recede, replaced by a watchful weariness. He named her Ilara in his mind, after a distant, silent star. Ilara, as he thought of her, watched him with an intensity that missed nothing, the way he mended his worn clothes with surprising neatness, the gentle murmur he used when coaxing a nervous squirrel to take a nut from his palm outside the cabin door, the deep lines of thought etched on his brow as he read by the flickering lamplight late into the night. The cabin was a small, confined world, filled with the scent of wood smoke, drying herbs, and the faint, lingering odor of antiseptic. The vast, indifferent wilderness pressed in from all sides, its sounds, the howl of a distant wolf, the sigh of wind through the pines, a constant reminder of their isolation. One morning, he left the cabin door slightly ajar when he went to fetch water from the creek. It was a silent question, an offer of freedom. When he returned, she was still there, sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Where, after all, could she go? The wilderness was as much a prison as any chain. Her strength gradually returned. She began to move about the small cabin, her steps hesitant at first, then more assured. One afternoon, while he was grinding herbs, she picked up the broom he'd fashioned from twigs and began to sweep the rough-hewn floor. It was a small gesture, but it felt momentous. Another day, he found a stew he'd left simmering over the fire had been stirred, a few wild onions he hadn't added himself now flavoring the broth. Silent acknowledgments passed between them, a language woven from shared space and necessity. Yet, a shadow always lingered in her eyes, especially when she looked towards the distant east, where the faint scar of the new railroad construction was sometimes visible on a clear day. He noticed how she'd stiffen at the sound of riders passing in the distance, her breath catching in her throat. Alistair didn't press. He knew fear when he saw it, and hers was a deep-rooted, pervasive thing. His own unease grew. During a rare trip to the settlement for supplies, he heard talk. A man, hard-eyed and wearing the telltale badge of a railroad enforcer, had been asking questions. Questions about a woman, seen fleeing west. Alistair, offering his usual laconic responses, felt a chill settle in his gut. He bought his meager supplies, his mind racing, and said nothing of the silent woman in his cabin. He knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his chest, that her past was not just a private sorrow, but a tangible threat. Then the blizzard struck. It came howling out of the north, a white fury that obliterated the landscape and trapped them within the cabin's four walls for days. The wind shrieked like a banshee, piling snow against the door and windows, plunging the small interior into a perpetual twilight. The firewood dwindled. The cold seeped through the chinks in the logs. It was during this enforced intimacy, this battle against the elements, that Alara's carefully hoarded strength gave way. A fever took hold, born of her earlier ordeal and the relentless chill. She tossed on the cot, her skin burning, her body racked with shivers. Alistair's professional calm was stretched thin, replaced by a raw, personal fear. He bathed her forehead with snowmelt, forced spoonfuls of precious broth between her cracked lips, and piled every blanket and pelt he owned on top of her. In her delirium, the silence she had so fiercely guarded finally broke. Fragmented words tumbled out, raw and desperate. Creed, he mustn't, the papers, not the valley, no, not the valley. Jonah Creed. The name was a whisper of power and ruthlessness, the railroad baron whose iron will was reshaping the West, often with brutal disregard for anything or anyone in his path. The papers. The valley. Alistair began to piece together the shards of her nightmare. She wasn't just a victim of random cruelty, she was a fugitive, carrying something dangerous, something Creed wanted. When the fever finally broke, leaving her weak but lucid, she found Alistair asleep in his chair, slumped beside her cot, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. His hand, fallen loose in sleep, lay near hers. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a captor, not just a rescuer, but a man who had fought for her life with a quiet, unwavering dedication. He hadn't mentioned her delirious words when he awoke, just offered her water, his eyes gentle. A fragile seed of trust, planted in the frozen earth of her fear, began to unfurl a tentative shoot. As the snows melted and a pale spring sun brought a tentative warmth back to the land, Ilara's physical recovery progressed. With it came a subtle shift in her demeanor. She began to take more initiative around the cabin. One morning, Alastair found his favorite, much-mended shirt laid out, a tear in the sleeve stitched with thread so fine and even it shamed his own clumsy efforts. He merely nodded his thanks when he saw her later, but a warmth spread through his chest. She started to venture outside, at first just to the edge of the aspen grove, then further, exploring the awakening land with a cautious curiosity. Alastair, watching her from a distance, saw a resilience in her that amazed him. He began to teach her small things, how to identify edible roots, the safest way to cross the swift-running creek, how to set a simple snare. The lessons were conducted mostly in silence, through gesture and example. One afternoon, as he tended his meager herb garden, she came to stand beside him. She pointed to a common weed he'd been about to pull, then mimed grinding it and applying it to a wound. He recognized the plant from an old herbal guide he owned. Its properties were indeed as she indicated. A rare, small smile touched his lips. He'd learned something from his silent patient. The unspoken tension between them thickened, no longer just the tension of shared confinement, but something softer, more complex. It was in the way their hands brushed when passing a bowl, the brief, shared glances across the crackling fire, the comfortable silence that settled between them during the long evenings. Ilara still didn't speak, but her eyes, once mirrors of pure terror, now held a universe of unspoken thoughts and emotions. He knew her fear was not of him, but of the relentless shadow of Jonah Creed. Sometimes, he would find small, intricate charcoal sketches on scraps of bark left by the fire, a depiction of a verdant valley, the snarling face of a powerful man, a woman fleeing through a storm-darkened forest. By morning, they were always gone, burned to ash. The precarious peace was shattered when Alastair had to make a journey to the settlement. A child in the Baxter family was gravely ill, and their desperate plea had reached him via a passing trapper. He was loath to leave Ilara, the unspoken threat of Creed's men a constant presence in his mind. But her eyes, when he told her he must go, were steady. She gestured around the secure cabin, then pressed into his hand a long, sharpened stick she had whittled, its point fire-hardened. It was a token of her own resolve, a silent promise that she would not be helpless. He accepted it with a solemn nod. His return, 2 days later, was to a scene of chilling violation. The cabin door hung crookedly on one hinge. Inside, his few belongings were strewn about, drawers emptied, blankets tossed aside. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Ilara," he called out, his voice hoarse. For a moment, there was only the echoing silence of destruction. Then, a floorboard creaked beneath his cot, and slowly, a small panel he hadn't known existed was pushed aside. Ilara emerged, pale and trembling, but blessedly unharmed. Dust and cobwebs clung to her hair. Her eyes, wide with remembered fear, met his. She didn't speak, but pointed towards the east, the direction the railroad lay. He saw the fresh tracks of 2 horses leading away from the cabin. They hadn't found her, but they knew someone was here. And they would be back. There was no more time for silence or hiding. They knew Creed's men would not give up. Alastair began to pack essentials, his medical kit, the last of their dried meat, his rifle, and ammunition. As he worked, Ilara watched him, her face a mask of grim determination. Then, she moved to a loose stone in the hearth, one he had never noticed. From the small cavity beneath, she retrieved a slim, oilskin-wrapped packet. Her hands trembled as she held it out to him. Inside were papers, deeds, letters, meticulously copied ledgers. Proof, it seemed, of Jonah Creed's illegal land grabs, his coercion, his ruthlessness in carving his iron path through the territory, particularly through a fertile valley her delirium had named. Her eyes, fixed on his, were luminous with a desperate plea for understanding. This was why she ran. This was why she'd been silenced. They were just about to slip out into the pre-dawn gloom when the sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet. Too soon. Creed's men. More than 2 this time. Alastair pushed Alara back towards the cabin's rear window. Go. Run for the high rocks. I'll hold them. But Alara stood her ground. She looked at Alastair, at the grim set of his jaw as he chambered around in his rifle, and a new, fierce light blazed in her eyes. She would not run and leave him to face this alone. Not again. The riders reined in, their faces hard in the grey light. One of them, a burly man with a cruel scar across his cheek, smirked. Alastair recognized him as the enforcer from the settlement. Doctor, the man drawled. We know she's here. Send her out. Creed wants his property back. She's not property, Alastair said, his voice level, his rifle steady. Just as the enforcer's hand moved towards his own holstered pistol, Alara stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, the oilskin packet held firmly in her hand. Stop. The word, her first spoken aloud in months, was clear and strong, cutting through the tense air like a honed blade. All eyes, startled, swung to her. The enforcer's smirk vanished. She met his gaze directly. Jonah Creed will not get what he wants. Then she looked past him, her eyes finding another man, one whose face was a study in shocked recognition. Alastair saw a flicker of something terrible pass through Alara, the memory of the mine, the chain. You, Thomas, she said, her voice resonating with cold contempt. You left me to die. You work for a thief and a murderer. He will discard you just as easily. She held up the packet. These papers detail every crime Creed committed to steal the land for his precious railroad, especially through the Grayling Valley. Let us walk away from here, and they will never see the light of day. Harm us, and I've made arrangements. They will find their way to a federal judge. It might have been a bluff about the arrangements, but her conviction was absolute. Alastair stood beside her, a silent, formidable presence, but this was her battle. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Creed was a fearsome enemy, but documented proof of his crimes was a different kind of danger, one that could bring down even him. The scarred leader weighed his options, his eyes narrowed. Finally, with a snarl, he spat on the ground. This ain't over. Creed will hear about this. About you, talking. He wheeled his horse, and his men followed, melting back into the trees, leaving behind a silence more profound than any they had experienced before. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension remained, thrumming in the air. Alara swayed, the immense effort of her defiance, the sudden release of her voice after so long, overwhelming her. Alastair's arm was instantly around her, steadying her. He looked down at her, not with surprise at her voice, but with a deep, searching tenderness that spoke volumes. She looked up at him, her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, were clearer than he had ever seen them, the haunted look lessened, replaced by a fragile, hard-won strength. Alastair, she said, his name a soft breath, an acknowledgement, a bridge finally crossed. He simply nodded, his hand firm on her arm. The ransacked cabin, the silent wilderness, the looming threat of Creed, it all receded for a moment. He gently guided her back inside, away from the violated threshold. He took the precious papers from her trembling fingers and placed them on the rough-hewn table. Then, he took her hand, his grip warm, a silent promise of shared burdens, of a path forward, uncertain, but no longer solitary. The quiet of the cabin enveloped them, a fragile sanctuary, earned in the crucible of fear and courage. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more.